I'm the last speaker today, and you're all very tired. So I'm going to have an easy start and then wake you up a bit before I throw in a little bit heavy thing in, and not too heavy. So I'm going to talk about modeling residual stress in soft tissues and discuss issues and examples. Doesn't work. Oh, okay. I'll use this one. Oh, just like this, maybe. Yeah. Okay. So, motivation of studying soft tissue is to try to understand the human body, or even small part of it. And so this already has a very long history. For example, in 14th, 15th centuries, there are already those big names contributing to our understanding of human body circulation and the cells and muscles, and mechanics was very powerful then, and people can somehow use simple mechanics rules to establish a lot of principles and laws. And Descartes is one of the very optimistic scientists, and he was saying that if you give me the motion and extension, I will construct the world. And so mechanics was that powerful at the time. However, when this is applied to human body, the view is not shared by later comers, because the journey has been really hard, and I think we all share this view. It become harder and harder now. For 100 years or so, there haven't been really quiet. Not much progress was made in understanding soft tissue mechanics. So this is until in 16th century, when the theoretical framework of continuum mechanics has been developed by people like Euler, Navier, and Cauchy, and particularly soft tissue always undergo large deformation, so it's nonlinear. It's very different from engineered material, which has a linear elasticity. So the nonlinear elasticity first took shape by the work of Rivlin, Trisdale, Noel, Green, Spencer, and Riordan, and a number of others around the 1950s and the 70s. But modern biomechanics hasn't started until really some 50 years ago by Y.C. Feng, and he's not only studying continuum mechanics, but he also engaged in doing the experiments and actually testing the soft tissues. So he was first to discover that in the soft tissue, that stiffness, which is a stress divided by the stretch, which is a length change when you stretch a tissue, is proportional to the stress itself. And also there's some residual stress, but later people kind of brushed it away. So assuming there's no residual stress, and then you integrate this solving for stress, and then you find that the stress and the stretch relationship is exponential and not linear. So this is a so-called famous exponential law. So Feng's law. So Feng's law, you say, is being dominating in soft tissue mechanics, and it's still dominating now. And this is a linear relation, one-dimensional, not linear. This is uniaxial test, so one-dimensional problem. But this being later extended to 3D. So why it is so challenging to study soft tissues? And this is because human organs are extremely complicated. And so it's I already mentioned the nonlinear elasticity. And it also has a nonlinear fluid mechanics, and also has the electrophysiology, chemical, and fluid structure interactions. So there's in terms of mechanics, there are a lot of issues, which each of them is hard to model. And tissue also grow and remodel, and depending to the loading conditions. And of course, there are multi-scale processes, which a lot of them we don't quite understand. And I today only want to concentrate on a very small issue, which to me is still very big, is that tissue has residual stress even if there's no loading, which is different to many materials we know. When you remove the loading, you assume the stress, the stress is free. There's no stress in the body. Okay, so now I need to introduce a little bit of a mathematical framework So because it's a larger deformation, that means we always consider two different configurations. So you have to, when you talk about stress or stretch, you have to say which configuration you are talking about. So if you have a so-called reference configuration, and then with this configuration you apply force, then you stretch it or move it to a different configuration, then the deformation gradient, which is just if in 1D is just dx by d x, d small x deformation by d big X. So the in 3D is kind of called grad. It's just deformation gradient. This is a measure of how much a particular cell material, not cell material, a tissue material is moved to another location. And because the volume doesn't disappear, you always have a Jacobi bigger than 0. And the deformation gradient is really a nice measure, but it's not symmetry, and it's because there's a rotation involved. So polar decomposition can take away that rotational vector tensor. So you have a purely stretched vector tensor, which is symmetric, and big U is measured if you are standing in the reference configuration, or big V is if you are looking in the current configuration. So you always have two different measures depending where you stand. And those U and V, because they are symmetric, so you can apply powerful mathematical rules to reduce 9-element tensor in a 3-element eigenvector or eigendirections. So this reduces things dramatically. So this is really powerful thing. And sometimes people just like if this is a stretch, because you always have to consider negative and positive stress. So it's easier to use stretch squared. So B and C are just like stretch squared. So B is U squared, C is V squared, if you like. And those are symmetric again. Because they are symmetric, you can use spectral decomposition, reduce the tensor dramatically. And that will give you invariance later. So before that, I need to say that so stresses, so nominal stress tensor is the force in the current configuration and divided by the area in the reference configuration. This is experimentally easy to measure one. But the real stress is called Cauchy stress, is the force in the current configuration divided by force in the current the area change. So that is what the tissue experiences. But it's quite hard to measure if the configuration is changing all the time. And so people often use nominal stress and Cauchy stress interchangeably, and the relationship between them, you can always derive them. And this process of getting one or another sometimes is called a pull back or push forward, depending if you got a stress in one configuration, you want to change back and forwards in a different configuration, depending whether you want to measure with the experiments or whether you want to explain the true stress. And so the stress satisfies the equilibrium equations. Again, two sets. If you don't have a body force, then it's just divergence free. So in the reference is the big divergence free of S, and the smaller symbol is used for current configuration is a small divergence. And this whole system with the boundary condition is a boundary value problem, but it's not closed. So you need to know the constitutive relationship between the stress and the strain, which usually describe the material properties. So for a particular type of material, which we call hyperelastic, there exists a strain energy function. This strain energy function can give you a nice relationship between stress and the strain. And that will then close the whole system and enable you to solve things in principle. So everything else is a generic, but for all soft tissues. But this strain energy function is one for that particular material. So material characteristics is always given by strain energy function. So if you want to study a soft tissue mechanics, the key often is to find the suitable strain energy function. And as I said, because F is not symmetric, so if you squared F, then it becomes symmetric. And that means you can reduce everything into 3 invariants. So if you use I1, I2, I3 for isentropic material, then the strain energy function is really simple. So what are I1, I2, I3? They are kind of measures of C, because in 1D you only need to know stretch in one direction. But in 3D it's a bit more complicated. So I1 is, if you think about this, is a 3D kind of deformation. So I1 is just a sum of lengths. In fact, it's length squared because you used C. And I2 is the sum of area of this box. And I3 is volume of this box. And they correspondingly measure the squared, stretch, shear, and the compressibility. Okay, so in terms of mechanics. And if you have incompressible material, that is often the case for soft tissue, then I3 is always 1 because you don't have a volume change. So you introduce Lagrange multiplier, and then you're only left with I1, I2. So it's still 3 variables. And the Cauchy stress now is can now be derived if you have a W. Okay. So how do you specify the strain energy function? How do you obtain it for a particular material? So you have 3 ways. One is theoretically you can derive from microstructure following all the way from cell to soft tissue. And this is probably most the mathematical rigorous approach. And the other one actually is more commonly used is a phenomenological approach. You do this stretch test, or uniaxial, biaxial, or shear stretch. And the third one is what also very commonly used is by educated guesses. So New-Hawking material, which is very famous material used for describe rubbers, actually used approach 1. So they use molecular chains and interaction cross links, and this derived statistically, and then that gives you a very elegant expression so that strain energy function is only a function of I1 with a constant C1. So from there, you can derive the Cauchy stress, which is now a kind of linear function of B, which is a squared F in the current configuration. And because it's looking almost like linear, of course it's not linear because this is squared, but looking like linear with B, so that's why it's called New-Hawking. And then Fung's law now extended to 3D now is exponential, so it's also a function of I1 only, and this is exponential, and this is more suitable for soft tissue. All the others are now combination of these two. So that's what we call educated guess. And so that's for isentropic material. What if you have in the tissue you have one preferred direction? So you got a group of fibers aligned in one particular direction, M, for example. In that case, 3 invariants are not enough. You have to introduce 2 more, and so that is the direction M and times dot of MC. So it's like a squared stretch along direction of M. And you also have I5, which reflects the shear strains, which
this material has now a cylindrical symmetry. Basically, you have one preferred axis, but in the other 2 dimensions, it's isotropic. Huh?
Yes. So that's called transversely isentropic. It means you have one dominant direction. Okay. So for this, you need 5 invariants. And then, if you have an orthotropic material, that means you have at least 2, sometimes 3 preferred directions. Then you need to introduce more variables. So you have, for example, you got M and M prime, and then you have, in addition to have I6, I7, I8 is the interaction between the 2 directions, for example. And the soft tissue, unfortunately, is orthotropic. And in addition, soft tissue has a residual stress. So this is shown by cut of arterial ring. So this is unloaded configuration. So if you cut it, if nothing happens, then there's no stress in it. But now this arterial ring actually spring open. That means there's actually a lot of residual stresses in it. And so if we call stress residual stress tensor tau, and we look at the configuration again, so before we had a 0 stress configuration, and after loading you have a deformation gradient go to the current configuration or deformed configuration. But now we have a reference configuration here, but in this reference configuration there is already residual stress, and now from here to here you can apply loading. And so there are actually 3 configurations. One is called deformed, one is called unloaded, one is called 0 stress. So all the strain energy functions are initially developed for 0 stress configuration. So now if we have a residual stress, then you need to take that into consideration. And the residual stress typically also satisfy the equilibrium equation, but the boundary condition is no loading. Okay, and if you somehow can find a way from here to here, find the deformation gradient, then you can get the residual stress, and then the total deformation gradient would be this one product this one. Okay. So one very popular method is called the opening angle method. Is also first developed by Feng, and is to consider a cylindrical simple structure for arterial artery, and then this equilibrium equation, tensor equation, then because of the geometry reduces to a simple ODE, and then with a suitable boundary condition, you can solve them analytically and obtain the components of the residual stresses, and there are only 3 principal directions. Okay, so so that is one way that you can use opening angle method and obtain residual stress. There are also other ways you can, assuming you somehow found it. Then how do you change the strain energy function? So your strain energy function now is either you can write it as a function of deformation gradient, elastic deformation, plus some kind of residual stress, or you can think about you have 2 parts. One is due to elastic energy, one is due to residual stress. And then I already mentioned for isentropic materials, you needed 4 more invariants. So those are product of tau and C and tau C squared and so on. And this is work is done by Ray and his colleagues. And for transversal isentropic materials, in addition of this, you need to consider m, tau, m, and all that. And so you need 5 more. So you have 9 invariants. And this work is also done. It's a lot of iterations, but theoretically it's done. If you have a residual stress, we know how to construct a strain energy function with all these invariants included. For orthotropic material, there are many more, probably 27, something like that. Nobody have a go now. And so if you want to make some kind of progress, you could try, but even Ray gave up. So alternatively, people start to think differently. So residual stress really is linked to the growth remodeling and tissue reabsorbing and growing and adapt. And so that you may not go in this way. In fact, you try to involve the natural configuration with the tissue adaptation. So there are a whole branch of other approaches doing use growth tensor to try to model how tissue change with the time.
Could you comment why you have the superposition of the WE plus the residual?
Oh, this.
And not, for example, the product. Maybe.
No, it's not product. It's deformation.
Why not the product? This is my question.
Yeah, because energies due to residual stress and due to the strain energy, they add. Only the deformation gradient they become product. So so this can be so change deformation gradient is a product. Energy is adding. And this adding has a condition, which is that you have a incompressible material. Otherwise, you have to time some kind of Jacobi in front of those to determine the volume change. But I make it simple here. Okay, so and now that is a theoretical kind of introduction framework, and we try to use this to model a couple of examples. So I'm just going to show 2 here. So one, the big title is modeling residual stress in a beating heart, and the practical title is a simplified model of left ventricle, because heart had 4 chambers. So left ventricle is only this part, and this is actually the most important part because it's a high pressure chamber. And if you look at the cross-sectional cut of the wall, then you know there's a complicated fiber sheet normal structure. So the fiber bundles are aligned and changing from inner wall to outer wall, minus 60 degrees to positive 60 degrees, rotating around and along the sheets. And the sheets themselves also rotating from inner wall to outer wall. So it's a complicated structure, but can be modeled as orthotropic material. So in this case, we have a so-called HO model. So Horsath Ogden developed this model, and they use I1, I4, I6, I8. So you can see that they first, because it's incompressible, you don't need I3, and then you think share is small, so you dropped 5 and 7. And then this term gives you the I1, which is isentropic contribution. It's like Fong's model if you only consider matrix. And those terms are the fiber orientations along different like a fiber sheet normal directions. And this is again another Fong's, but just a different Fong's model. So it's just combination of Fong's model, but representing the exponential behavior along the fiber and in the matrix and so on. So this is a model which being extensively tested against the experiments and give best fit for the myocardial soft tissue. And
Ask a question.
yeah.
So I remember that there are some of these energy functionals which actually violate thermodynamics, which means that you actually do a pulling experiment, you relax it, and you get out more energy than you put in.
Yeah, but that is not applicable in this case. So in this case, we assumed hyperelastic material, and for strain energy function of this type is all been proven to satisfy thermodynamics equality. And so the theoretical work is already done by Haushofer-Ogden, so that we now use this. But the one you talk about is Moulin effect. That is for different condition. If you have this strain function, if you then usually you use experiments to do fitting these parameters, and then you can get Cauchy stress. Now I call it HO Cauchy stress, and then. Now you're left with the equations, and everything is closed, so you can solve them, but you can't solve them analytically anymore. So you have to solve them. We use numerical methods, and then before that you need to construct the geometry. So we actually construct geometry based on MRI of real patients. So this part is the most boring part and the time-consuming part, and least you can say. But my postdoc, Hao Gao, did most of this work. So you do the segmentation, you put fiber structures in, and then to make sure that those can give you the realistic presentation. So how about residual stress? So the heart is never unloaded even. So if you look at the PV curve during the heart contracting, even during the relaxation, the pressure is never zero. So we want to add residual stress in the unloaded configuration, but we don't even know what this is. If you get all you have is the current configuration at any point of this curve from MRI. So there's a number of other methods to recover unloaded configuration first, which I want to mention here, but we did all that as well. It's relatively easy. And then we need to add the residual stress to the unloaded configuration to find out.
Just for curiosity,
yeah.
The unloaded configuration, does it have a very different geometry than the heart as we know it, or is it only a minor change?
It depends where you start. If you start from here, then it's smaller change. So you try to start when the pressure is lowest. Sure. So the heart will wrinkle a little bit, and then so you load a little bit, it become the right configuration. That's how people do it. You use a inverse approach, iteratively do the numerical simulation to make sure when you add that loading, everything looks like image. Okay, so now how do we add the residual stress? All we have is opening angle method for cylindrical. So what we do is we treat the left ventricle as a cylindrical for the residual stress part. So we chop the apex off because we don't know what's happening there. And we think most of the residual stress are in the middle region. And in that case, we can use opening angle method, and people do this kind of thing. They cut the heart open and measure the opening angle, and then use a K to express the degree of the opening angle alpha. So when alpha is 0, the K is 1. And that gives you the deformation gradient from the opened configuration to the closed configuration. And then you can, in principle, get the residual stress from this expression again. And then after that, you can add loading. Okay. And so now so even for isentropic material, you still need to introduce 4 more invariants. So those are the 4 modes that I mentioned before. But if you look at these expressions, both tau and c are small, in the reference configuration because it's very, very low loading at the time. So that means this one is leading order, and this one, and all these are higher orders. And so in fact, we tested numerically that we found that only using one of the invariant is insufficient. We don't need all the other high orders. And better still, this residual stress-induced strain energy is quarter of I6. So you don't even need extra parameters. And after that, you can just derive it. And get, because you know the expression now, you can get Cauchy stress. So this is work published in 2013. And I'll just show you one graph of the component of of the total stress with the residual stress in the fiber direction and across the wall from inner wall to outer wall. And the dashed one is without residual stress. The solid one is with the residual stress, but with only I6. And then the solid one with the circle is with the stress with all these different, all four terms, which make it a lot more complicated. But you can see the differences is almost very, very small. So that's what we say, only use one is sufficient. So there are two messages here. So one is I6 is sufficient. So this is one very quick way to add residual stress to the heart. The other one is, as you expected, this with the residual stress, you do reduce the peak stress, especially in the inner wall. And this reduction is not that significant. It's about 10% maybe in the normal heart. But it could be more significant in the diseased heart. And also importantly, we now have a framework to incorporate residual stress if you can evaluate it experimentally. So what about the active contraction? That was only passive stress, so that is only this part. So active contraction, if you assume the active contraction are along the fiber directions, so then you can use these cross links of the myosin and actin and in the relaxed and contracted cases, and people developed a lot of models to link this active tension with the casein transient and the sarcomere length. And so this group of ODEs here you can solve, and then you can compute this active contraction. This is if you assume everything simultaneously contract. If you are only interested in mechanics, then you don't need to worry about the propagation of the sequential spatial contractility, because that's much faster than mechanical. But if you do want to also model the sequential contractility, then you, in addition, need to solve advection diffusion equation, which make the computational lot longer. But depending on your question, whether you wanted to study mechanics or want to study electrical behavior of the heart. So how do we solve? How do we solve the fluid-structure interaction? And in fact, all the simulations I showed you, I just go quickly through the methodology for people who are studying numerical methods. But if you're not interested, you can switch off for a minute. So basically, we solve Navier-Stokes equations, and this Navier-Stokes equation has a source term due to the presence of solid. And we embed the heart into either a regular fluid domain or adaptive domain. And you can solve the Navier-Stokes equation assuming you know this force for U. And then once you have a U, you can then, if the solid, because solid moves with the fluid, so solid is fully embedded in the fluid. So there's no slip boundary condition. And this no slip boundary condition, because they use different coordinates, is established by a delta function. And then so the U will be transferred to the solid displacement to X, and with the X, deformation gradient can be established. And then if you have a constitutive law, you can get a passive stress. If you have an active contraction model, you can get passive and active stresses. You add them together, then you have a new body force from the divergence of S plus some boundary conditions, and then you put it back to the right hand side term, and then you do currently we do explicit time matching with very, very small time steps. Okay, so that's the result of the pumping heart. with the fluid structure interaction, which we can't show. So we overlap it with the image, and just to say how good the model is. So you can see mostly is doing a good job, except at the apex, and the model is overshooting a bit. And they are, I think, two potential reasons for this. One is the real heart is wrapped by epicardial. Is it, how do you say it? Pericardia, and so that restricts the apex, and we don't have that. The second is the fiber orientation near the apex is really hard to get it very accurate because it's quite messy there. So using a rule-based fiber structure probably doesn't do a good job there. But in general, so we can in principle model the heart, at least normal heart.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Now the Stokes equation for the blood, isn't it?
Now the Stokes equation for the blood, yes.
Yeah. I mean, shouldn't it be a non-Newtonian fluid due to the...
It should, but we're not considering that. I think in the heart, with the velocity is so big, non-Newtonian effect is very small. Yes, if you have a diseased case and blood get clotted in the local area, that might be effect. But I think in normal heart is not a more relevant question is tissue. So tissue actually is viscoelastic, which we haven't considered. A lot of things we haven't considered. But in the normal heart, again, those are small effects.
Question?
Yeah.
I may have missed it because it went by quickly, but when you're applying the immersed boundary method the way you do, can you really take account of the detailed deformation in the heart wall, or are you is that somehow put into a point force?
We do. Okay, so this is not the immersed boundary method, the traditional one, which is what you say. They use points, force, springs to represent the structure. We kind of, together with Boris Griffiths, developed a new, improved immersed boundary method, which is called immersed boundary finite element method, where we use finite element to represent the structure. So that's this bit here. And then we use the finite difference to represent fluids. And then we put this, and then so the coupling is still the idea of Charlie Peskin. So we put the forces to the fluid, and the fluid to carry the solid. But the solid representation is a purely finite element using string energy function.
So you solve the evolution equation for the structure as well, and then
actually
translate it to a point for the fluid?
No, that's good. Very good question. We like to solve the structure as well, but we don't need to at this approach because the mesh is really, really fine, and solids at every point follows the fluid. So the movement of the solid is entirely solved by Navier-Stokes equation because it's of no slip, and both are incompressible. So basically, fluids is, if you like, fluids and solid overlapping at that time. So solid motion, we don't need to solve a separate equilibrium equation for the displacement because this already is following the fluid. So this is why we have to do explicit time matching. If you want to use implicit ones, then it would be better to solve the solid equation as well, but that would be more expensive. So there's a lot of work going on to improve the method as well, but we can talk about this. Okay, so I'll just give you a second example of how we add residual stress in the aortic dissection model. Again, we use a cylindrical model for artery. So aortic dissection is a tear in the aorta and a large artery, and where it could be quite fatal if you're not be sent to the hospital and have an operation within 48 hours. So because it's always emergency, and the mortality is really high, and the doctors really like to be able to have more time to prepare the theater, everything, and they would like to know when a patient needs to be operated immediately or whether it can wait for a few days when things are ready. And so to do that, they really like to know whether the tear will propagate under certain conditions. There's no way they can predict. So this idea is we hope we'll be able to help them in the longer term, but in the short term we use simple models to try to understand what's going on. So we use a consider two-layer residual stressed arterial model. So the arterial model, there's a median and adventitia, and we don't consider intimate because it's too thin, or it's too thin to bear the loading, but it's important in other things. And so the strain energy function now is now called HGO model, but you can see again it's New-Hooking model plus Fones model. So educated guess again. But of course it's rigorous duration to make sure it satisfies all the conditions have been carried out. And then so if assuming this artery, if you cut it, it will sprung open to some kind of a angle. So for this case it's 90, but we studied all others. And then we want to say if you introduce a tear in the wall here, what will happen if you have residual stress or not. So what we did is if you have a tear and you have a pressure in the lumen and you also have the same pressure in the tear, assuming there's a lot of leakage through the little gaps, but we don't model that because in the tissue the tear must be through the inner wall somehow get into there. But so for the simplicity, we'll model the pressure to be the same. So we model when you have a pressure, the tear start to propagate, and then we read out the critical pressure with the if you have a different opening angle. Okay, so this is already closed from opened with the opening angle into a reference configuration with the residual stress. So that is represented by the degree of alpha. So this is the critical pressure. And then so how the tear propagate is governed by a so-called cohesive zone. Cohesive zone is actually very simple. What happens is before the tear starts, you have a stress concentration there. So before the tear really happens, you have a zone where the tissues already become softened. So the tissue softening already happened, but they don't break instantly because you have to have a zone to allow that to happen. That is based on energy argument. So this is a developed model. We're just using this, and then this one tells you how this tear will propagate. So the critical pressure with the opening angle, you can see how opening angle make the critical pressure higher, and that's another mechanism of residual stress. Residual stress not only reduce the peak stress within the inner wall, but it also make it safer, so make it more tear resistant. So residual stress is developed there for various reasons. So this is quite interesting. And the other thing this is I just show you this one more slide, is this we also try to study the length of the initial tear, because if you have very, very small tear, because actually the doctor said a lot of patients have tiny tears, but even in normal patients, even in normal people, but those tears do not propagate, and then sometimes they heal up. Only when the tear length is big enough, they become dangerous and start to propagate. In fact, we've in our earlier work in a strip, not cylindrical geometry, we discovered that the longer tear is easier to propagate than shorter one, and that makes sense. But here, when you have a tear along the cylindrical direction, then the story can be different. So if you use angles, so the 30 degrees corresponding to arc length of 30 degree and 90 degree and 150 and 210, so different lengths of tear. If the tear following the circular ring, then there's a different story, because if you have very short tear, then critical pressure is high because it's very hard to propagate. If you have a very long tear, it's also hard, because the energy is used to buckle this slip. Okay, so once this buckled, then there's not much energy to push this tear to open now. So this situation stress contribution is reduced. So if you have very long one, then it actually becomes harder to propagate. If you have something in between, then there's competing mechanism again. And it's interestingly how the residual stress play a role to change these different mechanisms. So without residual stress, they all increase the critical pressure in general, but in the median length, the residual stress can make these two behavior qualitatively different. And in case you find this kind of thing really bizarre, we actually found an image from publication in circulation. There you can see that in the real patient how this lumen become collapsed. And so we actually found quite a lot of images corresponding to what we have simulated. So that's another example to show you how residual stress is. Yes?
Sorry, what would be a tear with the moving heart? Isn't it expected to a small tear to enlarge, or if
this is not in the heart. This is in the artery now.
but
I mean, it's still.
It's still positive pressure. We only consider the static pressure, so this is only static loading at the moment. And for artery, I mean, it's positive as well. And so there is a dynamical, there's a lot of things you can do, but we're only making first step. Okay, so now I showed you two examples and showed you residual stress can be important. Now one question is one cut enough? Is residual stress fully relieved in one cut? And the answer is no, because the recent, not quite recent, experiments on the heart, because a lot of opening angle cut is done on the arteries, but even in arteries, one cut is not enough. People been debating about this because Feng himself did multiple cuts along the radial directions and found there's no change anymore. And other people said there is change. But the thing is, if you do a lot of radial cuts, you may not release more residual stress. But if you do a circumferential cut, then this inner wall initially is curved inside this dashed line. It bounced back. So that means there's a huge residual stress still in that cut, and that is not residual stress-free configuration. And this is, and maybe even this is not if you cut again. So how does that impact your results? So we did a simple, again, based on the experiments, to put one cut, which we solve quickly, and two cut, one has negative curvature. You can still get the equation, the boundary conditions with the stress compatibility in the middle layer, and to get enough equation to solve this. And then we even have can do one more cut. So I won't bore you with the technical details. So the conclusion is with the 4 cut, and so we have 1 cut, 2 cut, and 4 cut model. And then experimental data with the inner ring and the outer ring, that radius and the wall thickness, the comparison improves when you have a more cut. But that's not the important story. The important story is if you look at the stress distribution along the transmural across from inner to outer wall, 1 cut now focus on this black one, which is hope stress, which is the residual stress. This one, the maximum is about 2.58 kilocapacitor. If you have a 2 cut, now the 2 cut, there's actually sharp change of gradient. The maximum hope stress is 200 something, and the 4 cut is slightly higher, but not much higher, and qualitatively it's smoother, but qualitatively is similar. But the issue is now the multiple cut give you the ratio bigger than 100, 80, roughly 100, and that is a significant underestimation of the residual stress. So when we had a soft tissue workshop, I presented the results, and Jay Humphrey asked a question, say, but your model is too simple. Have you considered the heterogeneous material properties, because the stiffness changed across the wall, and they did some measurements in 1994 to show that how the material properties, if you measure the middle, and the outer wall, they change all the time. So have you considered that? Maybe that is the reason why you have such a high stress ratio. So what we did is the measurement is black lines, and because we have a dog, we have a mouse, so we use the slope, but we still use our average material properties, the center line, because before we assumed everything is constant across the space. But now we also use a similar slope. This is not an exact thing for the mouse, but we don't have the mouse data. So we put this back in the model, and then we did the 1 cut, 2 cut again. We didn't bother with the 4 cut. We just want to see what the ratio is like. And the ratio now is 35. It's not so high now, but it's still significant. That means the more than 1 cut is still really, really important, because you can and so much underestimate the residual stress if you don't have 1 radial cut. To make sure that we haven't really got something really numerical error, we compared this with a house of organism model of 3-layer artery model. They put a inner wall and the median and the adventitial layer, 3 layers, because they teared off, so they can measure different opening angles, and then put it back and then computed the maximum residual stress, which is 23. Then they published it. And so we want to compare the ratio. So we just use the same model, same material, but only with 1 cut. and that give you hope stress 0.59. So the ratio is about 40. So it's about the same as we have discovered for the heart. So that means seriously we need to consider at least 2 cut and then we need to rerun all the previous results I showed you and say how that will change the results. And so now somebody might ask me, what is the question? So why bother doing all this? So the question is driven by clinical needs because doctors really want to know what happens in the diseased state. For example, if you have a heart attack, the tissue will grow and remodel. And if you have an advent growth remodeling, then it will have a dilatation and heart failure. So, and that is linked to residual stress because residual stress and growth and remodeling are closely linked. And so residual stress is measurable. Growth and remodeling is very hard to remodel unless you do some kind of agent-based model all the way from cell level, which is one approach. But I think just going from this approach, there are too many parameters to measure and too many uncertainties is not enough. I think we should combine both. One is from the global view, measure the residual stress and link that to the potential growth remodeling. The other one is from bottom up and model the multi-scale situation and meet somewhere in the middle or compare with each other. I think I have used up my time, so I won't say anymore. So basically this is ongoing work. Basically you can see actually we only started wanting to do something, but it's very challenging. And I should say this work is in collaboration with Riogden, Colin Berry is a clinician, and Steve Roper, who is on aortic dissection, Nick Hill also worked on aortic dissection. Boris Griffiths is my long-term collaborator. We're doing the immense boundary and fan element method together. Thank you.
So many thanks for this very impressive talk. Are there any questions?
So the fact that the residual stress depends on the type of cut you make, does that suggest that your energy function should really be a joint function of the stress-free deformation and the residual stress rather than this additive form?
Yes, I write them in additive form, but this is misleading. They are joint because tau from the residual stress part has all the information of the information in the first part. They coupled. So I only write this to give you a conceptual easy understanding, but they are coupled because sigma in the first term has tau embedded. They coupled with each other. So that the invariance I6 is actually tau times C, and C is the deformation gradient caused by the whole stress. So the coupling is in there. Yeah.
I would like to ask if cutting is really the only method to measure.
No. Cutting is the easiest one, and the mostly used one. And modelers like to use the opening angle method. People have been for sheep and dog using beads, and they embed the beads across the wall, do this 3-dimensional block of tissue. But then you're limited how many beads you can put in, and if you put in here and not there, and because the heart is so complicated, so there is no very effective way of measure the residual stress into a perfect accuracy. I have to say. So that's why I think you have to do step by step. So measure residual stress. Do multiple cuts if you can, or do multiple beads.
In my field of single cell biophysics, there are now many stress sensors which are actually building on fluorescence. Has anybody tried to use this?
No, I'd like to talk to you.
Out of,
the problem is the reference.
No, the point is these sensors measure the stress over a very specific molecule.
Yes.
Then you would, in order to connect this, you would need to be sure that you catch all the molecules.
Probably we would take the sarcomere because this is where most of the actin or something like that.
So one approach I didn't get a chance to say is by Holmes group. They use agent-based model. So what they do is they have a cell, use a lot of cells, and the cells are migrate along the gradient of chemochem, and then you have a lot of cues, mechanical cues, structural cues, and the persistent cues, and you add them together and put it in a wrapped probability function. So give you the, and then all those fibroblast cells align, rotate the fibers. So the fibers are in the end all aligned with the, so this is one approach I would like to try. But currently this model is only for 2D, and also it's quite computational intensive. We are trying for very even simpler, even not even for just for piece of a squared surface. But the reason I come here, because I'm an outsider here, is to talk to people like you, and you do a lot of cell modeling and do experiments as well. So I need data and this kind of mechanism, and to develop this kind of model and then put back into my organ soft tissue.
Can I ask one more question in this direction? I mean,
Yeah.
molecular, where exactly is the residual stress situated? Is it the collagen gel? Is it the sarcomeres? It's hardcore, isn't it? I mean, it's during development, the residual stress is built up and kept somehow.
Yes.
So is it in the extracellular matrix, or is it more in the muscle fibers?
I think okay, so my matrix is not the same as your matrix, because my matrix also has the isentropic fibers.
Yeah.
Because my fiber contribution is only the orientated with the preferred direction.
Yeah.
But if all the fibers are dispersed, then they become part of my matrix.
Yeah.
So yes, so in that sense, I think it's in that combined matrix. That is where the residual stress is, because the fibers are wrinkled. Or preferred direction fibers are wrinkled in the reference configuration mostly. They are not stretched yet. And then it's the matrix plus the isotropic fibers. They are bearing the residual stress. So this combination of yeah.
Last question.
Can you give us a qualitative view of how the residual stress changes one's understanding of the propagation of aortic aneurysms, for instance, of the tear in how does the residual stress affect that tear propagation process?
So residual stress, because residual stress try to make the stress more distribution more uniform across the wall. If you without residual stress for the artery with under pressure, inner wall will be a lot more stress than outer wall. With the residual stress, they make the stress distribution more uniform, and that uniformness will reduce. If you have a tear, if your stresses around the tears are more uniform, that reduces stress concentration also at the tear tip, and it's the stress concentration near the tear tip that drives the propagation. Okay, and the other one I thought you want to ask is how growth remodeling will relate to residual stress, and this is how, because cells will elongate, they'll be widened, they'll be resorbed, they'll proliferated, and then when you bend them, they become like that. And so if you cut them open, they come back. And because if you have a loading very, very high or stress very high, the cells are not happy because they won't have an equal share. So they grow more to carry the load, and then they become cramped and they crease together. So they are happier when the load is added. If you cut them open, if you take the load off, some of them actually are not happy because they are squeezed more.
Okay, so I think we should close the session. Let's thank the last speaker again for this.